The 5th French Republic? There's been 5 French republics? How, you might ask? Well, hopefully in this video we'll answer that question sufficiently well for you to get a sense of why things had to change constantly. We're going to start with the old French kingdom. We're not going to go too far back, just give a bit of a summary. And then we're going to progress all the way to the French 5th Republic. So, sit back, relax, get your chill on, because this is going to be a fairly chill video, and enjoy yourself. So first we have the Kingdom of France. This originated as West Francia from the Treaty of Verdun in 843, when the Carolingian Empire was split up into various sections, though the only one that matters for this is West Francia. It was a fairly weak and not fully centralised state. It was a complete feudal society. Eventually, Francia would be established in 987 with the rise of Hugh Capet and the Capetian dynasty. This dynasty would rule for the next 800 years under various cadet branches, ending nominally with the Bourbon dynasty, though there was another cadet branch, the Orleanists. The ruler of this kingdom originally ruled as the King of the Franks. However, in 1190, under Philip II, the monarchy officially changed its title to King of France, and thus the Kingdom of France was basically officially born. For most of its history, this kingdom was essentially a decentralised feudal kingdom. But the kings of France were very interested in establishing a strong centralised control over this feudal society, hoping to get rid of loyalties to local lords and replacing it with loyalty to the crown. This long, slow process of centralisation and abolition of old-style feudalism eventually succeeded fully in 1680, when France became an absolute monarchy under Louis XIV, with basically all power being centralised under the so-called Sun King. While Louis XIV did manage to turn France into the most powerful nation in Europe, this power was not to last. Various wars in the 18th century, under Louis XIV's successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI, completely bankrupted France. These wars were notably the 7 Years' War and the French aid to the Americans in the War of Independence. By the end of these, the French economy was completely crippled, so much so that when the next famine hit France in the 1780s, the growing French middle class, as well as the peasants, violently rose up against the monarchy in 1789. Keep in mind, famines were a fairly common occurrence throughout this time, as well as throughout most of European history, so it was fairly unusual that the uprising was this violent and this successful. The period from 1789 to 1792 is often called a constitutional monarchy, with the values of liberty, equality and fraternity supposed to be the rule of law, though in truth, this was really just a period of chaos. Through fear that the king, Louis XVI, was collaborating with Austria, who France was at war with during this time, the then newly created National Convention had him executed and declared the First French Republic, under the ideals stressed in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, and the ideals of liberty, equality and fraternity, and democratic principles. Universal suffrage was declared, and it was supposed to be a great time. However, this National Convention would rule France for the next 2 years under the very undemocratic Committee of Public Safety. This committee, led by Maximilien Robespierre, spent most of its time executing potential threats to the new republic, in the period that became known as the Terror. Understandably, this committee and Robespierre, as well as those who supported him, became very unpopular, and so it was overthrown in July 1794, essentially when the French people had enough of constant murder from its own government. France would then be ruled by the much more democratic but very dysfunctional Directory. The Directory attempted to rule the Republic through a democratic system which consisted of an upper and lower house, the Council of Elders and the Council of 500 respectively, but could not solve the general French problems of hyperinflation in the economy, constant war with neighbours, and internal rebellions and unrest. The Directory was eventually overthrown by a very well-regarded general, Napoleon Bonaparte, pretty much the only person preventing France from being completely overrun by these neighbours that France was constantly at war with. Napoleon would rule this republic for the next 5 years in an increasingly nepotistic and not very democratic way, until he stopped pretending that he wasn't a dictator in 1804, when he declared France to be an empire, with himself as the emperor. Under this French Empire, Napoleon ruled as an absolute monarch, returning essentially to the rule that had happened before the Revolution. Under this absolutist rule, France would expand greatly, very quickly, and then would collapse just as quickly by 1814. With the exception of a quick Napoleonic resurgence in 1815, the French Empire was replaced by a restoration of the absolute French monarchy, once again headed by the Bourbon dynasty. While technically being a constitutional monarchy this time, by the time Charles X became king, he was pretty much acting like an absolutist king, which caused another revolution in 1830, leading to Charles being replaced by a cousin, King Louis-Philippe, who came from yet another branch of the Capetian dynasty, the Orleanists. Louis-Philippe was fairly popular until around 1848, where by this time he too had made himself increasingly unpopular, by his unwillingness to be a complete constitutional monarch and his refusal to give more liberties to the people. And so, France got rid of the monarchy once and for all, establishing the Second Republic. This republic, from the get-go, would operate under a defined system, unlike the previous republic, which spent a lot of time going back and forth and having lots of arguments, violent arguments, about how and who would rule the republic. The way that it operated was that the powers of state were separated amongst the Council of State, essentially the Congress or Parliament, which would control the legislative, and the President, who would control the executive power of the Republic, and would be directly elected by universal suffrage. The first person to be elected President of this Republic was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, the so-called Napoleon III. The reason that this republic fell apart was because, under the new constitution, the president would only be allowed to rule for 4 years and could then no longer stand for re-election. This did not sit well with President Napoleon, so he had the whole system gradually dismantled while he was in power, because he was fairly popular and could do pretty much anything he wanted to. It seems that no one really thought about this when creating the system. And then, when his term was over in 1852, he proclaimed himself emperor, discarding the Second French Republic and declaring a new French Empire. Napoleon III would prove to be a fairly popular emperor until he wasn't. He increased French prestige on the world stage greatly, putting it on par with Great Britain. But when he lost a war against Prussia in 1870, he left France completely shattered, occupied and economically damaged. And as a result of this, he was deposed in favour of another republic. This Third Republic had a similar constitution as the last republic, with the legislative power being given to the Senate and the Council of Deputies, which was led by a president of the council, and the executive being headed by the president of the republic. The early days of this republic were shaky, as there was a violent revolution in Paris from 1870 to 1871, as well as calls for a return to the monarchy. But by the 1880s, things had pretty much smoothed out, as people had come to grips with this whole republic thing, and presidents giving up power once your term is done. While being a republic at home, France also developed a massive worldwide empire, and ironically, the subjects of the French Republic's overseas territories had no say in how things were run in this so-called republic, where technically more of its subjects lived outside of France and had no right to vote or decide how things were conducted. This republic would be dismantled by the Nazi invasion and victory over France in 1940. At this point, France was separated into 3 different entities. The northern and western part of France were directly administered by the Third Reich, while the southern and eastern part was left as a puppet state, headed by a government sympathetic to the Nazis. Meanwhile, a government in exile, based in London, headed by Charles de Gaulle, was established. And once victory was achieved over Nazi Germany in 1945, a provisional government was then declared, headed by the government in exile. In 1946, the French Fourth Republic was declared, and after a pretty heavily contested election, France ended up having a separation of powers pretty much in line with the last republic, with a largely ceremonial president that shared equal power with the newly created position of Prime Minister, who held a lot of executive power shared with the president, but was also head of the legislative branch of the government. Many thought de Gaulle would lead this republic, but through a mixture of disgust with the idea of a weakened presidency and anger at the successes that various left-wing parties had during the election, he retired from politics. This new republic, however, would not last long and would prove to be incredibly unstable, lasting only 12 years but having 21 different administrations. One of the main causes of the great instability of this republic faced was the question of decolonization after the Second World War. This started immediately after the Second World War, with the Indochina War, but only got worse with the Algerian War of Independence, starting in 1954. Initially a conflict of brutal suppression of Algerian rebels, the conflict was brought much closer to home when a group of disgruntled army leaders attempted to lead a coup against the government in the hopes that they could prevent the government from accepting demands of Algerian independence and doubling down on efforts to crush Algerian hopes of independence. While the coup was defeated, it had proven once and for all that the French Fourth Republic needed to change. With the government in shambles, Charles de Gaulle was asked to help create a new constitution, which he did, and this time there would be a strong presidency that could make proper executive decisions by itself, similar to the powers of the American president. This did not mean that the legislative was defunct, just that there was a complete separation between the two. He also attempted to solve the decolonization question by putting out a referendum across all French possessions, asking the people of these possessions to either accept the new constitution or declare themselves independent. It's quite funny to think that, with the exception of French Guinea and a few other small island possessions of the French Empire, that the first time the people of the overseas possessions were asked any sort of democratic question, they chose to leave the French Empire and the French Republic. Interesting, it's almost like they weren't an equal partner to begin with. But yes, the result of the referendum was that almost all of France's overseas territories decided to strike out with independence. As for the crisis in Algeria, this was resolved in 1962, when, after the war was finally ended, France allowed Algeria its independence. At the same time as this referendum, an election was held in mainland France, where de Gaulle won the presidency and ascended to being the first president of the Fifth French Republic. And there you have it. That's why France has 5 different republics. Obviously a lot has changed since then, but that's the basic gist. Okay, hello. So hopefully that explained why there are 5 French republics. I hope you learned something from it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. And yeah, see you soon. Maybe leave a comment about what other formation of nations you'd like to see. That was fun. Yeah. Maybe Germany, why there are 3 Reichs, for example, even though that's kind of a dark subject. Whatever, I'm rambling. Please, leave a comment if you want us to cover something, and don't forget to like the video, it really does help out. And subscribe, obviously, please. And, yeah. Have a great time doing whatever you're doing at this particular moment, after this video.